Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Alex Gordon, a prominent British trade unionist and Marxist who was elected last month as General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain. A former train driver with decades of experience in the trade union, peace, and international solidarity movements, Comrade Gordon previously served as president of the RMT Union and as a leader in the Stop the War Coalition and Marx Memorial Library. Focusing on building a united front against austerity, imperialism, and war, Comrade Gordon's election as General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain, succeeding Robert Griffiths, marks an exciting new chapter of Britain's growing Communist Party. The Communist Party of Britain fights for public ownership of key industries, workers' rights, democratic freedoms and civil liberties, for peace, and against imperialism and war. In the months and years ahead, the party will intensify its work in communities, workplaces, and campuses, and step up the fight for peace, democracy, and socialism in our lifetimes. I welcome Alex Gordon to Savage Minds. I try not to look at the videos of what's happening in Gaza because it would send me to a mental hospital. Unfortunately, I saw a video of a child in very dire straits, burned over 90% of its body, and oh my God, I swear, Alex, when I worked on a book, 2004, 5, 6, I dealt with the families of the suicide bombers. I dealt with the Israeli families who lost loved ones due to the suicide bombers. I understood very quickly why a 23-year-old ambulance worker, as was the case, would blow herself up. I dealt with the female suicide bombers in my book. Yeah. But I tell you, what I saw last night, I'm not a violent person. But anyone who doesn't understand violence, I watched that video and I'm like, oh my God, of course you would be violent. Of course you would be violent. Anyways, I haven't slept. I'm not very happy that our governments are giving a tacit nod to this. I am disillusioned by what is going on in Western governments who, at the General Assembly in September, they were up at the mic decrying all this madness about Israel, but nothing has changed on the ground. As the newly elected leader of Britain's Communist Party, I would like to know what your thoughts are about the state of this genocide in Gaza, of this warmongering that's going on both from the EU and people like Ursula von der Leyen, but also, oh my gosh, could we imagine Keir Starmer to be more Tory than he is? I don't think even Boris would have been doing this, but, you know. And then back to the US and Canada, where you see nice words coming out of Canada's Prime Minister's mouth. But again, they did nothing. They do nothing. They just talk the talk. And an impending war upon Iran, threats to invade not just Venezuela, but Mexico, if Mexico dares send oil or petrol over to Cuba. Could I have your thoughts on some of this? Because you've got a very big role. I'm wondering what you think could be done about it as not only the leader, but a member of Britain's Communist Party.
Well, hello, Julian. It is good to talk to you. And you've kind of hit me with such a stream of unhappy consciousness of what is happening in the world today. I'd just make a couple of remarks about what you've just said. I mean, I think you said, and you may not have meant it in this way, that there is a European, and indeed you could say G7 developed economies have given tacit support to the genocide that has been inflicted on the Palestinian people in Gaza, and to some extent the ethnic cleansing that is taking place in the West Bank as well by Israel and by Israeli settlers, with the active support of the Israeli state. But I don't think it's right to say that this has been tacit support. They're much more culpable than that. Our own government here in Britain as you said, led by Sir Keir Starmer, has been actively supplying arms, has been granting arms licenses for exports of F-35 bombers, fighter bombers, to Israel via the United States, and they've tried to evade their moral culpability by saying that it's only 15% of an F-35 fighter plane is built and constructed in British arms factories or in arms factories in Britain. But you can't fly an F-35 bomber with just 85% of the components. So these are essential parts of planes that have been used to bomb people living in refugee camps and shanty towns, inflicting the kind of burns, the terrible mass murder that you've referred to in your opening remarks. So I don't think that one can talk about tacit support. This is an active complicity, an active joining in a colonial genocide that is taking place in Gaza, and our government in Britain, in particular, along with the German government and the French, and of course the United States, are critical and essential to that genocide. Without them, without their ongoing support, the genocide could not happen, could not continue, and Netanyahu, frankly, would be in prison. Or at least that's the best outcome for him. So I just wanted to pick up on that issue. Look, you've outlined this world that is spiraling into a form of world war. I mean, there are some commentators who think that the Third World War has already started. They date it from the beginning of various different conflicts, but if you just itemize what's going on now, you have the conflict in Ukraine, which has led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, possibly more, possibly an order of millions of Ukrainians and Russians, not to mention the foreign mercenaries who've been fighting in Ukraine in support of the Ukrainian junta. You have a war in Sudan, which is the world's bloodiest war, a civil war in Sudan that is supported and funded and armed by the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and this is a war for resources, for control over resources, for geopolitical control. It's a classic imperialist war in Africa. We have a war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Congolese. Again, that's a war for rare earth minerals, for precious resources that are required for the military-industrial complex in order for it to access the necessary materials for weapons of war. So there are wars happening in Africa, in West Asia, or what we used to call the Middle East. There are wars also happening now, have started in Latin America. I was very fortunate 2 days ago to be with the grandson of Fidel Castro, Professor Fidel Antonio Castro Smirnov is making a visit to Britain. He's on a speaking tour. He's a scientist, a nuclear scientist, a very eminent nuclear scientist, and he's been visiting parliamentarians and various scientific academic institutions while he's been here, and he took time to come and visit the Marx Memorial Library in London, where I met him. And he said, we're already at war. Look, there are 32 Cuban heroes who've been murdered in Venezuela. attempting to defend President Nicolás Maduro, the Venezuelan president, from abduction, along with his wife, Celia Flores. The Cubans believe that there will be a hot war on Cuban soil. There will be a US invasion. That's the assessment that their government has. So we have a world that is at war. And I think the reflection which I would have on what your opening comments and about the impact that those pictures you saw on social media had on you last night is that in many ways we're all being traumatized and almost acculturated into a society, a normalization of extreme violence, of brutal violence. And so that's being done through mobile phone technology, through social media, which is, of course, heavily censored and heavily controlled by the political algorithms that are developed by the tech oligarchs and their minions working for the various different social media platforms. This is about normalizing brutal, extreme mass violence. So your reaction is a good one because you're still shocked and horrified by it. But I fear that it's going to become less and less common to be shocked and horrified. It's going to be more an acceptance of a normalization of this level of extreme violence, of course, mainly meted out to Black and brown people in countries that are outside the G7. So this is a very dangerous moment in the history of humanity when we truly could say that we have a choice between socialism or barbarism. Because I don't want to just paint a picture of a completely pessimistic picture. There are important developments taking place on a world scale that we can see as heroic and positive. They're not coming in the main from the United States, although I want to pay tribute to the millions of Americans who've gone to the streets in Minneapolis and Chicago and Texas and California and Washington and New York and hundreds and hundreds of other cities against the brutal repression being inflicted by the ICE, the immigration. I've momentarily forgotten the acronym. The federal agency responsible for kidnapping migrants off the street and deporting them. So,
Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Thank you.
It all came from the War on Terror,
yes.
Right? The global war on terror with 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security replaced INS, which was then called Immigration Naturalization Service. It's horrifying, Alex, to see that, as you just mentioned, we're living in this time of being bombarded with violence, at the same time being told it's vomitacious, the whole thing, because we're being sent messages that light-skinned people, that's a tragedy. A Christmas market drive-through that happens regularly now in Northern Europe, that's tragic. It is tragic for those families and those people. The Swiss fire recently. Mm-hmm. And then nobody, of course, as you mentioned, and we've been covering Sudan and the DRC. No, because when dark-skinned people are murdered, that's sort of like a rainfall or a snowstorm. It's just natural, right? And that's the way that legacy media presents this. This is how our leaders present this. And the kidnapping of Maduro, it was a nothing burger. The way that the BBC, I don't know if you saw the memo that they were sending out to their reporters, you're not allowed to use the word kidnapping.
Yeah.
What do you call it then?
Yeah. The language control is extraordinary, and even, I mean, you mentioned the Maduro kidnapping, but of course, the Western leaders, from Canada to Britain to France and Germany, all lined up to endorse the United States action, certainly to disassociate themselves from any condemnation or criticism of it in the abduction of Maduro and Flores. But of course, within a week, as the Trump regime revved up its intentions towards Greenland, you could see them howling about their sovereign rights, the sovereign rights of Denmark, a founding NATO member, a European country, a former colonial power, a founding member, not quite a founding member, but an existing member of the European Union, the sovereign rights of Denmark over Greenland. And, you could really see in those two moments that on the one hand, Venezuela, where the president and his wife are kidnapped, as you said. On the other hand, a week later, the clear intentions and beginning of moves by the United States to arrogate, to take control over Greenland. That hypocrisy, that European hypocrisy, encapsulated in the reaction to those two moments. And I think it's very telling that the Europeans are in this completely disoriented state now. The European nations are seeing the biggest relegation in their status in terms of world politics, geopolitics, and also in terms of geopolitical economy that they have ever experienced. Probably has ever been experienced by any group of nations, developed group of nations. Their economies are sliding fast into deindustrialization. I mean, here in Britain, we went through a sharp deindustrialization process in the 1980s under the Thatcher government, when much of our manufacturing and heavy industry was shut down or offshored. But you can see the same process happening now in a very, very brutal way in Germany, both encouraged by the loss of Germany's access to cheap, relatively cheap Russian energy, following the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline under the Baltic, but also the move of German capitalists to move their manufacturing base out of Germany, where wages are relatively high, to either Texas, where a number of big German companies such as BASF have recently set up plants. Texas, of course, is what the Americans call a right-to-work state without unions, but also to China, where they get access to cheap energy and a skilled workforce relatively cheaper than German wages. So you're seeing now in front of your eyes in developed European economies this epochal fall from a position perhaps of secondary importance in the hierarchy of world powers to a tertiary position. And it's going to have a devastating impact on our societies in Italy, in Germany, France, and it's already happening in Britain. So it's very, very important, therefore, that we understand the mechanisms are at work, the mechanisms that are at work, that we describe them accurately, and that we build a people's and a workers' resistance to these forces that are driving down our living standards and are really ending the post-war period of welfare states that existed after 1945 in some Western European countries. So that social model is now essentially being abandoned. You can hear that in the speeches of Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, but you can also hear it from President Macron in France. You can hear it in this country from Starmer and his acolytes who want to privatize the remains of the NHS, the National Health Service, who are looking to cut welfare benefits to people with disabilities. They attempted to do this last summer. There was a mass movement to push back against the cuts to disability benefits. And in the end, the government buckled and removed the proposed cuts. But they'll be back again. And if they don't succeed, then there are a variety of right-wing parties in Britain vying to be the next Thatcherite administration. I mean, the problem they have is that that won't resolve, even temporarily, the crisis of capitalism in Britain. You can only really do Thatcherism once. Thatcher sold the family silver, as one of her fellow Conservative politicians called it. She sold off the nationalised industries. She opened she opened the borders to global capital, to bring in the American banks and Japanese banks into the City of London. But those banks now today are very, very vulnerable, despite their enormous wealth. We have the biggest credit bubble in human history at the moment in the United States. I think sometimes people conflate the AI bubble, which is a massive part of that. But there's also just a tech bubble anyway, where you have these magnificent seven companies, as they're known, Nvidia, Tesla, Microsoft, Alphabet, which owns Google, etc., who together compose around about 35% of the total capital value of the US Dow Jones average. So you've got seven companies whose capital index composes around just over a third of the total stock market. These are very. When this bubble pops, the whole ship is going down. It's going to be cataclysmic, and the extent of the bubble hasn't really percolated through, I think, to most people. It's certainly been talked about in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and the business papers. They see the crash that's coming, and they don't know what to do about it. But if you take the complete value of all of the US stock markets and the private equity sector, it comes to just over 300% of US GDP. That's 3 times the size of all the goods and services that are bought and sold in the United States every year. That's the size of the bubble, of the credit bubble that's sitting on top of the US economy. So when you see Trump and Bessent, his Treasury Secretary, advocating these extremely aggressive economic policies around tariffs, around seizing Venezuela's oil, for example, around seizing Greenland's rare earth minerals. These are desperate people. It's important to understand they're not doing this from a position of strength. They're doing it from a position of desperation. We will see in 2026 that the US bubble, the credit bubble, will start to deflate, and it will either happen very, very suddenly, or it will. It's already started. You can already see in terms of the stock of some of the big seven. They're being sold now. They're being discounted because of the incredible and unrealizable values, profit values that had been predicted for these companies. People understand, investors, Wall Street investors, now understand that these values are not going to be realized. These profits are incredible, literally incredible, and unrealizable. So we are seeing in the United States in 2026, along with the beginning of a civil war on the streets of Minneapolis and other cities, we are seeing the bubble starting to implode.
I've been having quarrels on Facebook, which is never a good thing, but I'll preface this with the Family Silver comment was made by Harold Macmillan, a former Conservative Prime Minister, which is interesting to know that even during Thatcher's time, there were people on the right who completely saw the damages of what she was doing, largely in the north of England. For many years, I've written for leftist publications, and there's been a point of no return. And it's something that I might be sticking my finger in it with you right now, but it's where the pedal hits the metal, as they say, and where historical materialist analysis of class, education, housing, jobs, on and on, meet with this wall of identity politics. And this is when a lot of the places where I've published have said, we can't run your piece right now because, and it's always a problem because of, as you know, the battle that's been waging both in the UK and other Anglophone countries. Then I skip over to what's happened in Minnesota and many of the same activists who have been present at other such rallies, pre-Trump even, on the West Coast, Portland to San Francisco largely, where many of these feminists who've been making certain arguments over the years have been slammed by the very same activists who are decrying, and obviously rightfully so, to decry ICE. But I've asked people on my wall, I'm like, wait, ICE has been around since 2003. In fact, I know about this because I actually had to work with the US government and many of the insurgent groups popping up post 9/11, because what the United States did is it disappeared 14,000 Muslim men from the country. A lot of people don't know about this, but the ACLU did. I was working with some of their attorneys. I worked with the Center of American Islamic Relations, their people, largely attorneys, not always. And I worked with a lot of human rights groups in New York City in 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, because there was an epidemic of men disappearing, and they were disappeared not because they were at a protest against ICE. They were disappeared for just being Muslim in the United States. And so I asked these people, I said, I take that ICE is horrible, and I take that their mandate should be contested. I don't know if, and I'm not saying most activists are doing this because I'm very clear most are not, but if using violence against ICE is the way to go, because it pits a lot of problems for the future on top of creating the fertile ground for a civil war, which I think is happening, Alex. I really am afraid of what's going on in the States. When I see activists, again, not all, using violence, using tactics that will put our right to protest in the crosshairs. It happened here in Italy. I can't even tell you how disgusted I was during lockdown. The government, not Maloney, it was a leftist government, basically outlawed protest against anything COVID or vaccine related, okay? And it can happen anywhere. It can happen in the States. As you know, they suspended habeas corpus after 9/11. It's still, in many respects, suspended. So I have a problem with, and again, I'm a fellow Marxist. I believe in fighting powers that be. And I guess if necessary, it might come to taking arms one day, but I would really rather avoid that. And my question is, in all of these years that ICE has existed, these protesters were largely not there. And when I say these protesters, obviously previous generations as well, we've got the statistics. The way that ICE has been handling immigrants has not changed. Trump is not doing worse than Bush or Obama, by the way. What I reject is this partisanship in the United States. I think to a certain degree it happens in England, but less so, because I think a lot of Labour voters are very disillusioned with Sir Keir. They see that he's behaving very badly as a human rights lawyer. What are we to do when Biden is in office, Obama's in office? I witnessed very few, if any, protests. The minute Trump gets into office, it's Trump derangement syndrome. He's a fascist. He's a Nazi. I've had words with some of our writers. I'm like, if you're going to use the word fascist, I think it's a systemic problem. I don't think it's a people problem. And I have a problem, Alex, with this personalization of what we know to be true. Trump did not invent kidnapping leaders. Ask Manuel Noriega, but we can't because he died in prison. We can't ask the leaders of many countries that we have overthrown. Our BFF, Saddam Hussein, remember that? Who supplied bin Laden? You remember when 9/11 happened and the word of the day for the next 6 months was blowback, referring to the fact that we created our own terrorism? I think, on both sides of the aisle, by the way, that protesting in the name of Donald Trump, the evil Hitler, whatever, I don't think it's very productive. We need to be looking at systems of power that have produced this, because this was going on during the Obama presidency. This was going on during Biden. It was even going on during Clinton. Hello, Kosovo. I worry that this kind of football mentality has taken hold of political arguments such that people are not hitting the political ball. They're hitting the player, if you catch my drift.
I do catch your drift. There's a lot there. So let me just, your comments about ICE are quite correct. So, it's founded in 2002 as part of George W. Bush's so-called War on Terror, establishing the U.S. Homeland Security Act. It's the largest arm of the Department of Homeland Security, and it has received bipartisan support under both Republican and Democrat administrations. But I think it's key to understand that it is Trump's decision to unleash a civil war for absolutely opportunist reasons. He deployed, first of all, National Guard to Democrat mayor-controlled cities. He's using ICE to unleash war, terror, intimidation on working-class Americans. And this is what has shown US imperialism's bloody face to the world and to its own citizens. And this is completely understandable and typical of an empire in decline. This is what the British Empire did to people in Britain and Ireland when after they'd finished, well, they hadn't finished at the time, but after they had had over 150 years experience of massacring colonized peoples in India, in the Caribbean, in Malaya, in other African colonies of Britain. So when we saw, before the First World War, the big uprisings by industrial workers in Britain, the period known as the Great Labour Revolt or the Syndicalist Revolts, it was British colonial tactics were brought home. Warships were sailed up the River Mersey with their guns trained on working class quarters of the city. After the First World War, the brutal colonial tactics that had been used in India were deployed in Ireland to attempt to pacify the Irish uprising, independence uprising. And we've seen again and again in British history how the tactics that were first developed in counterinsurgency operations in Britain's colonies were later then brought home and used against a domestic population. So we're not surprised by this, or at least anyone who's understood Britain's bloody history wouldn't be surprised by this. This is absolutely typical, what is happening now in the United States, in American cities. This is absolutely typical of an empire in decline, where the tactics that were used in, dozens and dozens and dozens of cities around the world to suppress populations that the United States wanted to control, those same tactics are now being deployed back home. So I don't find that particularly novel. I think we can understand that in the long narrative of imperialism. Your point about tribal politics, you might want to call it, which is a feature, I think, of has been a cement, has been a sort of has been a feature of maintaining capitalist dominance and capitalist political hegemony over politics in the United States and Britain and other developed capitalist economies. I think that is breaking down. I mean, it's very hard to see how the Democrat National Committee, an obsequious and groveling body that has distinguished itself in its fervent support for Israel's genocide in Gaza. It's difficult to see how the DNC can retain its authority as the main organizing committee of the opposition to Trump, when the opposition to Trump is in the streets in their hundreds of thousands, supported by US labor unions. And I mean, I can't see how that Democrat run coalition can continue to hegemonize the left in US politics. I mean, I'm looking at it from quite a long way away, several thousand miles away. I think the political bipartisan control over electoral politics in the most stable Western democracies, quote unquote, including Britain and the United States, is in danger now of being breached. In Britain, we saw at the last general election just over a year ago, 18 months ago, in July 2024, Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, was elected with a massive majority of over 170 seats in the House of Commons. But he was elected on a wafer-thin majority of the popular vote. His party received fewer votes than the previous leader, Jeremy Corbyn, had received in 2019, and certainly a lot fewer than in 2017. So there's a declining voter base, and this is causing a splintering of political organisations. So you can see in Britain now, the Conservative Party is splintering into a hard populist national. Well, it's a populist conservative or populist nationalist party called Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, and a official Conservative Party. And these will probably come to a deal, enter into some kind of electoral pact before or after the next general election in order to ensure a Conservative reform government. But you can see the same splintering effect happening in the centre and the left of British politics, where the Labour Party has lost hundreds of thousands of members. It's gone from being a party, I think the largest social democratic, quote unquote, social democratic party in Western Europe, with about 500,000 members under Jeremy Corbyn, to a party with less than half that membership today. And you're seeing a splintering of its base, with lots of councillors, local councillors, elected as Labour councillors, leaving the party and either becoming independent councillors or in some cases joining the Green Party. So there's a whole splintering of politics, and it won't be possible to put this coalition back together again. In the case of the Conservatives, it's because there are structural reasons why the Conservatives can't revive their long-running and highly successful formula for controlling mass politics and mass party politics in Britain. It's essentially because in the 20th century, it was based on a promise to the British population and to the middle class of being property owners, of being able to own their own home. Now, the gap between earnings, wages, and asset prices is now so large in Britain that there's almost no possibility, unless you inherit from your parents, there's almost no possibility of even a middle class professional couple being able to afford to buy their own home. So we have a completely skewed housing market, which is it's a rentier economy that we're living in Britain, and the housing market is one aspect of that. So these are long-term structural reasons why we're not going to go back to the kind of bipartisan politics here in this country that you were describing in the United States. I just wanted to make that point. I think the situation in America is a bit more complicated because it's a bigger country with a lot more variations. But I think you'll see a similar problem for the capitalist class, the ruling oligarchy in the United States, to ensure continuity. And certainly, I can't see how we would, even if they were to ensure a return to some kind of rules-based, a president that paid lip service to some kind of rules-based international order, as Biden paid lip service while he was ensuring the extermination of the population of Gaza. Even if they were to return to that, instead of having Trump's bullying mafioso acts, it would still, I think, face major problems because the long-term trends in US society are now so deep that it's not going to be possible to deliver a political stability in that system while you have the decline of American jobs, the decline of American industry, the decline of American cities in the way that is currently happening, not just under Trump, but has been going on for 15, 20 years. So these are long-term secular trends, which mean, I think, the end of that bipartisanship. On the question, I'm sorry I'm talking so much, I apologize. But on the question that you raised, which is very important, about identity politics and how that relates to this period. So, I would, identity politics is the opposite of class politics. It's an attempt to replace materialism with idealism. The identities that are referenced in what we call identity politics are increasingly imaginative identities, not based on material class interests. But what it seems to me is important is that while those have been very prominent, as you've pointed out, in publishing, in left-wing political circles, and have led to multitudes of stories of cancellation, of censorship, and an attempt really to police, tone police and language police left debate. I do feel that trend is in retreat to some extent. It's partly because of scientific developments. I mean, it's very hard to ignore the scientific reports from bodies such as Dr. Hilary Cass, the woman who has published the Cass report into the treatment of children, non-gender conforming children in the National Health Service. It's very hard to square the identitarian politics that have gripped some elements and much of the left in this country, and more so, I think, in the United States. It's very hard to square that with these sound, evidenced scientific studies. And, we have to let light in on the darkness. There has to be there has to be proper scientific, rigorous understanding of where the medical and the scientific evidence shows us these problems have originated from. And that I think is, you can't, once that's out of the bottle, once those publications exist and are being shared and talked about, it's impossible to go back. And the other major reason that I think identity politics is in retreat in this country is precisely because of the intensity of the crisis. Class politics is having a revival. We're seeing we are seeing a return to a more materialist understanding of the reasons for the political and social crisis that we're suffering. And I'm not in America, I'm not in the United States, but I would be surprised if there wasn't a parallel development taking place in the US as well. That doesn't mean that we're going to be able to vanquish the very authoritarian, identitarian tendencies that have been institutionalized through higher education, through HR departments in corporations, through the trade union movement, which has suffered from policy capture a policy capture which has been resisted in this country by hundreds and thousands of women trade unionists and men, but leading feminists in the trade union movement have resisted the attempt to write women out of history, which is what this movement seeks to do, to erase women as a category and erase women's voice within their own movement. So I think that we are winning this, but the institutions have to be challenged. We have to win the battle in the institutions. There are some signs that in some cases there is a retreat from some of the more extreme positions that were put a few years ago. But we still see, for example, the attempt in this country to popularize ideas such as legalization of prostitution, or sex work, as it is titled, euphemistically. This has been a project of a sort of capitalist libertarian wing within the trade union movement, who've sought to use trade unions to front a claimed approach based around the rights of sex workers as a workers' rights issue. Well, feminists and Marxist feminists, I would say, particularly in the trade union movement and the labour movement in Britain, have pushed back successfully against this codswallop, and have argued successfully and have won a position that there is no safe form of sex work, of prostitution. Prostitution is essentially, in its essence, is rape, and so this is a major political discussion that's been taking place within the women's movement and the trade union movement in Britain, and I think that's emblematic of one of the key fault lines within social democracy and within the labour movement. Either it's going to go down the road of liberal identity politics, which essentially negates all the gains of the workers' movement. It will negate eventually all the gains we've made since the Enlightenment, or we're going to win back and hold the line and advance the rights of women, minorities, and the working class through mass struggle. And that's got to be based on materialist analysis, historical materialist analysis.
No, I completely agree. However, depressingly, the same women with which probably you and I have formed alliances on the, let's say, the gender front, many of these women, I'm going to quote one this morning because I wrote about that video that I saw on Instagram that has very much disturbed me. And a feminist wrote me, "God, you and your ilk really are demented Jew haters. I'm sure you would have been the first in line to sign up to Hitler's death machine. It's like watching the Holocaust happen again in real time." This is in response to my commenting about a child who was burned on 90% of his or her body, so young that I could not tell. Yes, yes, free Palestine, blah, blah, genocide, blah, blah. What's it like contributing to the West takeover by misogynistic, homophobic Islamist terrorists? She goes on. This is the kind of feminism, what I call genocidal feminism, and a lot of these women, Guardian readers, gender-critical feminists, are on the side of Israel. And I'm astonished. I've been asking people on the show, British, American alike. I've dealt with a lot of scholars from the UK in genocide and historians alike. What is it? Is it because of the British White Paper, the Balfour Declaration? Is there a historical guilt? Because, Alex, the funny thing is, as an American who spent a lot of time living in London, I'm really impressed by the number of pro-Israeli supporters who consider themselves Labour voters and leftists and whatnot. I'm thinking, they don't match. This just doesn't match. I have to wonder if the identitarian movement isn't just about trying to undo women's rights. I think it's far deeper, unfortunately. I think what's happened is that identitarianism was a gift to neoliberal leaders, obviously the conservatives as well, because why create housing? Why create jobs when you can create new pronouns? That's really easy to do. I could create with AI 1 million pronouns a day, I guess. Then I think back to years ago when I was living in central London on the canal and waterways. Yeah, I was on a narrowboat. I saw a lot of people, doctors, lawyers, architects, who could not afford a leg up on the housing market, and they were relegated to the boats. And this was happening all throughout the teens. It's still going on. The CRT, the Canal and River Trust, has had a great burden of managing this explosion of people moving on to the canals and waterways. And I think of when I interviewed one of your great muralists, Brian Barnes. He was the muralist who made one of the largest, if ever largest, murals in London called the Battersea Mural. Mm-hmm. And I interviewed him years ago, around, I think, 2010. We spoke about what Thatcher did to housing and the right to buy and his vision for public housing, because it's all been bought up. For our American listeners, right to buy allowed people in what we might call the projects in the U.S. a way to buy their home that they were living in. And this was a genius idea by Thatcher to get votes. She was able to somehow shift the voter market in her favor amongst people who otherwise would likely have voted Labour. This is one theory of mine, but she also devastated the housing market. I have friends in London who are professionals. They are architects and lawyers, and it is very hard to afford a rental. It is very hard, even harder now, to get on the buying ladder due to what's happened in London specifically as well, regarding being able to get a mortgage and be a proof of credit and the amount of money you have to make to be able to even get that, much less the ability to save money while paying London rents. And put this together with the rise of Farash Robinson. Has there been an overemphasis of criticism on the racist leanings, ostensibly, of people on the right? Or, and I'm thinking back to Marx and Engels and their writing on this outside of books, but letters specifically, about what immigration would mean in the hands of the bourgeoisie and how they could use immigration as a cudgel to drive down national wages, even to control laborers, to a large extent control union formation. I'll tell you this, Alex, in the run-up to Brexit, I voted to remain. I also wrote a load of pieces where I think I was guilty myself of wrongfully characterizing the Remain vote as uniquely a racist element of wanting to weed out foreigners. I think there was a bit of what Marx and Engels were warning about. I think that still exists. I think remember the Polish plumber? I think there's a bit of fear. It's not just about dark-skinned migrants. I think there's a fear of our jobs are being lost. Factories are being shut down. I'm introducing a lot of different elements because I think they're interrelated. I think that it's no coincidence how Thatcher was able to buy up votes from a certain class of people who would have likely voted Labour. I think at the same time that the elements of what she did, and then which led into, Tony Blairism and New Labour, the destruction that we also saw with Clinton on the other side of the pond, that nobody's talking about. We're making this about personalities, right? These horrible policies might be better characterized rather than Trump's orange hair. This is a problem of capitalism. And so I've got 2 small children. My daughter asks me regularly, but why aren't they being paid properly? And I'll explain to them that businesses make profits because of the price tags they put on items, but also the way they can minimize what they spend out to pay people. And that one day those workers, their dream is going to be to do the same thing to other people, unfortunately. And it's a tough nut to crack when, in a way, we're seeing this on a global scale now with the collapse of international markets, the way in which Trump promised to bring manufacturing back home, a nice thing to say, but delusional in terms of practice. How do we put together this kind of caricature that the left has created of the right, saying that everyone who supports closing down or making immigration more difficult, let's say to Britain, when the same actors on the other side of the fence, inversely, like Obama, were keeping out even higher rates. Obama kept out far more many people and kicked out a lot of people. In fact, he supported the use of the National Guard in many periods of his presidency. And I'm thinking of Ferguson in 2014, the shooting of Michael Brown, when the then Missouri Governor Jay Nixon ordered the state's National Guard to Ferguson. And then I'm thinking of Baltimore the year later with the death of Freddie Gray, when Maryland Governor Larry Hogan mobilized over 2,000 National Guard forces to restore order. Obama was critical in the former, less critical in the latter. I worry, though, that our responses of lambasting people in the same way that you've witnessed over the gender wars, people being called TERFs or transphobic, and now everyone's a racist, everyone's a fascist. I feel like we're speaking over each other. I worry that people on the right have actually similar concerns to people on the left. How am I going to feed my children? And I'm putting this all together because since lockdown here in Italy, this government has done nothing to address the reality of what it did. It's pretending like nothing happened. They're washing their hands of it. They sent letters to people over 50 to get vaccinated. I received a fine. They were fining us for not getting the vaccine, and then that disappeared because they decided that wasn't the right thing to do. But we didn't get a letter apologizing or saying that fine is no longer requested. Everything is like, I see nothing, I say nothing. So my question to you is, in this very dark time of late-stage capitalism when things are falling apart everywhere, is it useful to be characterizing the right as a bunch of racist, xenophobes, misogynists, instead of trying to meet with them to understand the commonality? Because what I'm finding when I talk to people on the right is that sometimes their concerns sound just like ours. And they're talking about wages. They're talking about the ability to find a flat that's a reasonable price. It just seems to me that the talking heads on the media are exacerbating the problems by making everything out to be more than it is, if you follow me. This is not just about racism. This is not just about right-wing capitalists, because most of all of us on the left and right, we're not the 1%. We're all struggling to survive, right?
Well, the terms left and right are of limited use and validity. And I think the quote that you started out that last contribution with, from some anonymous, or at least you didn't mention who it was from, some anonymous Twitter person or Instagram person who had commented on your on your post. Some very prominent people in the feminist movement refuse to solidarize with Palestinian women and Palestinian children and men and families that are the victims of an ethno-supremacist genocide by the Israeli state. You'd have to look at the individual reasons why particular people take particular positions in relation to support for the atrocities carried out by Israel. But I agree with you that that's a confounding issue for their feminism. They cannot solidarize with women who compose a majority of women in the world, that is non-white women. And I just wonder why. I think that has caused significant problems in this country. The Philia Conference, which is the largest feminist conference organised in Britain, last year was polarised between supporters and opponents of Israel when a rostrum speaker made comments attacking Israel's genocide and calling for solidarity with the Palestinians and Palestinian women. There was an outpouring of criticism and anger from some of those at the conference. So I wasn't there, obviously, but that is a fact, and that's true. I don't really want to. I mean, I think that's something that the women's movement needs to confront and sort out. That's my view on that. In terms of your sort of historical point about the right to buy legislation, that is to say, the sale of public authority housing, what we call council housing, because it's built and owned by local councils, public bodies. Yes, you're quite right. It was Thatcher's right to buy legislation, which was seen as being her genius political act, which would capture the votes of working class people in Britain who previously would have been confirmed loyal Labour voters, but saw their opportunity to get their hands and own an asset, a council house, which would put them into another economic bracket. This was about the same time as Thatcher was in the business of selling the British gas, selling off a little bit later they sold off the water companies, selling off the electricity, the Central Electricity Generating Board. So all of this privatization policy took place around the second Thatcher period in government, not after 1979, but after 1983, and it followed. It was a point of sort of the nadir of post-Thatcher, the post-Thatcher Labour movement, when the state was launching a armed offensive against the trade unions. During the 1984-85, there was a national strike by the mine workers. It was followed by a set-piece confrontation between Rupert Murdoch and the print workers' unions, where the print workers' unions were defeated, locked out and defeated following the attack on the miners. And then subsequently there were other groups of workers, including seafarers, who had their unions sequestrated and effectively shut down by the state. So this was a period of brutal class, state offensive, class reaction. And in that mix, the sale of council houses was a stone thrown into the lake, which it was hoped would create generations of conservative, working class conservative voters loyal to the Conservative Party. Of course, what's actually happened is that they either sold the assets and moved somewhere else, or they were passed them on in some cases to their children. But you can only sell those assets if the state can only sell public assets once. This is what I meant earlier when I said you can only do Thatcherism once. You can't do the same privatization trick twice. And they've sold all the assets. So they've now got a problem because they've got escalating, really incredible housing prices in this country, very similar, I'm sure, to parts of the United States and where you're living now in Italy. But the gap between earnings and asset prices is so great that no children of even middle class families have an opportunity to get onto the property ladder through their income, through their wage earning. So there's this vacuum, this political vacuum opening up, or has opened up, where the link between the political party that spoke for homeowners, the party of Margaret Thatcher, the Conservatives, that party has been delinked from its traditional voter base in the middle class, the lower middle class, and elements of the working class, where there's always been a Tory voting. There's always been a Tory voting base in the working class in Britain. In the 19th century, it was based on imperialism and the idea of imperialism, which was a populist political strategy to capture working class votes. And in the 20th century, it was based on imperialism plus home ownership. So we now have a situation where home ownership is impossible, where British imperialism is merely performing the act of being a tribute act, a lapdog to whoever the president is in the White House. And today, the president in the White House isn't even particularly interested in the role of Britain as its lapdog. It wants to pursue a US hegemonic strategy, which doesn't require partners, or at least doesn't acknowledge the need for partners or allies such as Britain or many of the other loyal NATO lapdogs. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. Now, when you talked about the relevance of immigration in domestic politics, and Britain is different from the US in the sense that in the United States, almost everyone is an immigrant at some point. In Britain, there has been a conceit that there is a native population which forms the majority, and then there are minorities who are immigrants, often from former British colonies, South Asia, Caribbean countries, African countries, from Hong Kong, various East Asian countries. Now, what happened in the 2000s was that under New Labour, so not under the Conservative government, but under Tony Blair's government in the 2000s, we saw the accession of the Central European states to the European Union at a time when Britain was a member of the European Union and Blair was pursuing a very advanced pro-European policy. The accession of the Central European states allowed employers in Britain to access skilled and semi-skilled labour in quite large quantities. So you mentioned the so-called Polish plumber, but the Polish government in the late 1990s and early 2000s had state programs to upskill people who worked in key industrial sectors such as the shipbuilding sector in Gdansk, to upskill them to become domestic tradesmen, to become plumbers and other skilled trades. When accession took place, there was indeed a glut of skilled workers and semi-skilled workers who were able to come to Germany, Scandinavian countries, Britain, France, etc., and supply those trades. And what we saw was that employers welcomed them with open arms, and very often these sectors, particularly the trade sectors, are deregulated, or at least are. There is not a single employer. There is a series of. You would have a series of subcontractors. So very often these people came as subcontractors and worked as, if you like, sole traders, independent traders working on major building contracts or working as in the domestic market. They were able to undercut the existing rate for the job, and that system caused a lot of the resentment towards Central European migration during that period amongst working class, skilled and semi-skilled workers would have originated in that contradiction. So one of the things that Blair was doing there was dispensing with the need for a regulated labour market and substituting for a regulated labour market instead a European labour market, which, so the idea went, was going to be an unending, unemptiable reservoir for competitive, which is a synonym for cheap or cheaper, labour for skilled trades that we needed in this country in order to carry out essential work. Now, that situation came to a crunching halt in 2016. The Brexit referendum, or the referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union, which you referenced in 2016, was not simply a vote on whether or not Britain should remain a member of the European Union. If you cast your mind back, you will recall that what we voted on was a treaty that had been negotiated by the then Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron. And the treaty was about Britain's future membership of the European Union, and it included a number of opt-outs for future British membership, which included the right for the British government to not include EU citizens, that is to say, non-British citizens from EU member countries, in welfare provision. So what had been presented, or what was presented to the British public as being a referendum in favour of inclusivity, was nothing of the sorts. It was in fact a highly racist proposition that was being put to the voters to vote in favour of continued EU membership on the basis of a two-tier system of access to welfare in this country. That is to say, access to healthcare, access to housing, access to social services, etc., etc. Now, the people behind Cameron had made a calculation that this would be enough to buy off what they regarded as, in the word, I think the words that you used, what they regarded as essentially a working class racist opposition to EU membership. Now, there are various ways you can interpret this. The most hostile would be to say that it wasn't enough to buy off that opposition. But the truth is that Britain is a highly multiracial country in which people from people who I work with and live with have families and links all over the world, from Ireland, Scotland, but also from Bangladesh, India. This is a highly integrated multiracial society. There was absolutely, I would say, absolutely, racism was not the motive for most people who voted to leave the European Union. They were simply fed up with being used as a pool for cheap labour, and the the other factors that were really important in that election, beyond immigration, was that there is still a memory in British society of when it was possible to have a national industrial policy, when it was possible to have nationalized industries, such as a nationalized railway system, nationalized water, nationalized utilities, such as energy, water, the postal system, the gas and energy systems. All of these have been taken away from us within the last generation or two, and there's a very keen understanding amongst large numbers of people that we're being fleeced and robbed day in, day out by avaricious corporations that are living off our backs. So one of the key points of weakness for those who wanted Britain to remain in the EU in terms of winning public support was the fact that the EU's own treaties make it illegal and effectively impossible for governments to renationalise their railways. I mean, our railways are a good example of that. I'm a railway worker myself. We had our railways privatised in 1995 under the blueprint put forward by the European Commission at that time. We had a succession of terrible rail accidents in the following 5 years after privatisation, which led to the collapse of the system. It's been maintained by state subsidies in private hands since it was privatised at great cost to the public, both in terms of the price of it costs to travel by train, to buy a ticket, and also in terms of the subsidies which the state and the Exchequer pays to the private companies that run the system. So the current government, the Labour government that we have now, is in the process of renationalising our railways, creating a body called Great British Railways, which is going to own all of the track, the power, the signalling, and the trains, and to run them as one integrated system, publicly owned. This would not be possible if we were a member of the European Union. And there was a keen understanding, I would argue, amongst many people that if we wanted a different kind of society in Britain, we couldn't create that inside the treaties of the European Union. We could only create the basis for a more equal society, for a better run society, for a society in which we invested in decent jobs and in our cities and our towns and our communities. We could only do that by leaving the EU. The tragedy has been that while we left the European Union, we've not managed to elect a government which has been able to engage with that programme of investment and renewal that is required. I mean, the renationalisation of British Rail is just a tiny part of the job that needs to be done in Britain today in terms of taking control of the commanding heights of the economy and putting it in the hands of the people.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. I completely agree with your assessment here. In fact, when I came to understand my errors in a few articles I wrote, where I hadn't read this before, but there was a piece that the Guardian ran called I Walked from Liverpool to London. Brexit Was No Surprise by Mike Carter. Brilliant piece. And it changed my mind about everything. In fact, when my vote was not the winning vote, I was like, okay, we lost. That night, however, Alex, I spoke to friends who, similar to myself, had voted to remain. Only their response was very different from mine, saying, oh, we lost. Theirs was, well, we'll have to have a revote. I'm like, what? You can't redo it. Now, there were a lot of faults, as you probably recall, around the Brexit vote. We were told it wasn't a real vote, first of all. We were told it was a consultancy of our opinions, like we were being polled. We were told that this wasn't going to necessarily translate to anything. That was the first thing. And I was alarmed by how the media, and I am thinking of leftist-ish media, responded to this. No one really accurately covered anything, such as what you pointed out earlier. What we weren't just voting to leave or remain in the European Union. There was much more at stake. Now, you were on the side of Lexit, and I remember reading the views of Lexit afterwards because I had one child. I was extremely busy as a single parent. At the point, I was in the center of London, and I remember thinking, okay, this is an interesting point. And I spoke to another Lexiter. She's also a feminist who's since passed away, Magdalene Burns. We spoke a lot about this, and I was really convinced that it was a good thing that my vote had lost. However, when I referred to the Polish plumber, by the way, I was specifically referring to what happened after the debate over the EU constitution, when the French politician Philippe de Villiers used the term as this kind of boogeyman to frighten Europeans, especially the French, into believing that Eastern European labor would destroy French jobs, right? And this was clapped on in the UK by people on the right as well. The Polish plumber turned into a tense political issue in the UK, also because coincidentally, the immigration of roughly 600,000 Poles who moved to the UK following the EU expansion vote. Now, when you were speaking about class, I was thinking about the issues pertaining to class in the 19th century and the British Empire, where you had active personnel in the army around mid-19th century, 150,000, two-thirds of whom were stationed outside England, and the vast majority who were illiterate and unskilled labor. So it was a really good way to have a job. Plus ça change, we don't see much difference today, except that the war veterans returning from Iraq II, even from Iraq I, these are the people, mostly men, who are taking jobs in this new post 9/11 era we're living in. It's the defense contracting industry. It's anything from a local police officer to a mall cop to ICE. And there are working class issues here. Despite my loathing of ICE, I worry that in the US, we don't look at class issues at all, really. It's rising in consciousness, but people see monoliths. They see ICE as this Gestapo force, and most of the people making up ICE were victims of the global war on terror themselves. They were lied to, told, we're going to go over there, we're going to get Saddam, we're going to get Osama, we're going to arrest and they came back destroyed, mentally, physically, depressed. The suicide rates are not reported, as you well know. There's a whole repression in the media of talking about what happened to these men, mostly. Women too, but mostly men were on the front lines. And I find it really disturbing that we're about to enter into perhaps another bombing of Iran, if not worse. Venezuela, threats made to Cuba, threats made to Mexico. Do you think that people today on both sides of the Atlantic are aware that the people being sent to war, just as in Victorian England, as today, will be the poorer classes, just like the very people who voted against staying in the European Union are the ones, even on the right, who thought about working class relations and how they're going to survive to feed their family. Because as you well know, many people on the right are proud members of the working class. They don't want a handout from the government, but they also have a problem, as they would say, immigrants are coming here and taking our jobs. We know that's an artifice, you and I, but how do we translate that artifice when you've got Sir Keir? Really, he's kindling the flames of a new war that, as you pointed out at the beginning of our conversation, I believe we're already in a World War III. It's insane what's going on.
Yes. The current situation for people living in Britain and in Europe is very worrying, because our politicians, both at a EU level, personified by the ghastly figures of Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, and at a national level, personified in Friedrich Merz in Germany, Macron in France, of course, Meloni in Italy, and although she's slightly I think she's slightly off message as far as they're concerned. And Starmer in Britain are engaged in an exercise in rearmament, which, if history is any guide, European rearmament will not lead to a war with Russia, because Europe would be wiped out in a very short order. But European rearmament may well lead to a war between European nations. That has been what has happened in the past. We've seen back in March 2025, the EU President Ursula von der Leyen announced this program that she triumphantly proclaimed as Rearm Europe. And that was subsequently rebranded as Security Action for Europe, because the acronym SAFE sounds so much nicer than Rearm Europe.
It's insane, isn't it? It's like Monty Python.
Oh, yeah, it is a Monty Python. It. Exactly. Yeah. The money associated with it is very interesting. I mean, she's proclaimed an 800 billion euro fund. So I guess that's I'm not quite sure what that is in USD, but it's a lot of money, right? Of EU military support in order to continue this disastrous war in Ukraine, which is essentially wiping out Ukraine as a country. And if it continues, Ukraine has already been more or less depopulated, has lost its energy infrastructure, has lost strategically on the battlefield, and will concede massive amounts of territory in any settlement. And while the enormous sums that Ursula von der Leyen announces were intended to grab the headlines, and they did, if you actually drill down and look at where the money's coming from, the EU's proposal is for private capital loans of about 150 billion euros. So that's a quarter of the sum that she's talking about, or less than a quarter, about 20%, in order to fund this military spending bonanza. The rest of the money, the 650 billion euros, is going to have to come from EU member states. So that's about 80% of that spending package is going to have to come from EU member states. And it's only going to come from one place, and that's from cutting welfare spending. So despite all of the enthusiasm of the generals and arms dealers and bourgeois politicians for cutting public education, healthcare, housing, and civilian infrastructure investment in order to pay for military spending, it's important to make the point that no European government, not in Italy, not in Germany, not in France, and not in Britain or anywhere else, has yet succeeded in a wholesale switch of public spending from welfare to warfare to create this new warfare state which they dream about. So we saw in June last year, June 2025, at its Hague summit, NATO member states committed to allocate 3.5% of their GDP to defence, and a further 1.5% of their GDP to what they call defence and security related expenditure. So that's kind of, I guess, infrastructure projects that are related to the military-industrial complex, and that's the target date for that is 2035, only 9 years away. But the support for that proposal was not universal. The Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, called the pledge unreasonable and said it would have damaging consequences for Spain's economy and social welfare. And according to the IMF, 17 out of 27 EU member states are already breaching the EU Stability and Growth Pact, which is the debt brake, essentially. So it's a target of 3% of your GDP deficit and 60% of your GDP debt that can be spent on civilian infrastructure investment. This increased demand from the military-industrial sector is going to smash all of their spending commitments and spending plans. And while Germany has abolished its own domestic debt brake rule in 2025 in order to boost military spending, other countries are not following suit. The Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, whose budget deficit in 2025 was over 5% of GDP, said his country won't be supporting increases in defence spending this year.
That's right.
The British government has committed to this 5% of GDP spending target for military expenditure without any public or parliamentary debate whatsoever. And they announced the plans to increase the UK's defence budget by cutting international aid. But the attempts that Keir Starmer made, as I've mentioned before, as I mentioned to you earlier, the attempts Keir Starmer made last year to cut welfare spending met with powerful public and political protests. And these are the real world difficulties for politicians of slashing the welfare state to create a warfare state. And if you look at the opinion polling for Starmer, Merz and Macron, they've now achieved the lowest historical poll ratings of any ruling party leaders in their respective countries. And I think this just indicates the real problems that they're facing. And we've then most recently seen Trump on the 7th of January this year pledged to increase the Pentagon's budget by 50% from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. I mean, it brings to mind the character, the Dr. Evil character from
from Austin Powers.
Yeah, Austin Powers. Yeah, it's a $1 trillion. Yes, exactly. Exactly. So this is to create this dream military that he talks about, but it's a nightmare for everyone else. And at this stage, it just seems as though he's making up random numbers to stabilize share prices.
He'll also face pushback from his own Make America Great Again people, because the interesting thing here, I'm sure you've seen it, is that most of the MAGA supporters are not into these wars. They've become more anti-war than the Democrats, paradoxically.
Well, I've heard that. I'm not convinced. I mean, I think there's been a lot of internet, YouTube and online talk about how MAGA is opposed to the never-ending wars, but it seems to me that there's very little sense in which MAGA has actually pushed back. I mean, whatever MAGA is, of course, there are these big MAGA influencers like Tucker Carlson and others who have fallen out of love with elements within the Trump menagerie that he's assembled around him. But I don't see any sign that MAGA contains an anti-war movement. I mean, I may be missing something, but I just think that this is projection. A lot of people who have taken a position that the Biden Democrats were really, really awful, which they were, and that Trump could not possibly be worse, are seeking to find a silver lining on the Trump presidency. But MAGA doesn't represent a silver lining. It is really a reactionary political force, and I don't see where
it is. I wasn't trying to say it's a good thing, but Marjorie Taylor Greene, Rand Paul, J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, Thomas Massie, they've all pushed back, to a lesser degree Vance, because he does the cha-cha-cha with Trump because of his position, but they've pushed back to the degree that Greene has left office now. She's leaving. And I think a lot of the people that said that they were behind him and they were some of his biggest cheerleaders are no longer waving the pom-poms. You know what I mean?
So her commitment, Marjorie, you mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene, her commitment to the cause of opposing never-ending wars is to retire from politics. That's not much commitment, in my opinion. And
I agree.
And as for Vance, I mean, Vance is a creature of Peter Thiel. He's a creature of the tech bros who are reliant on the US Treasury Department and the state to bail them out when the coming crisis occurs in the next period. So I mean, if Vance is MAGA, then I'm afraid I'm not convinced. I'm even less convinced. I mean, there are other Republican senators. You mentioned Thomas Massie. I mean, Rand Paul is not a Republican. He may be
a libertarian.
He's a libertarian, exactly. So, I mean, American politics is complex. I'll grant you, it's very complex, and it doesn't cross over easily to this country. I mean, the far right in Britain, which is essentially historically the fascists in Britain, in British politics, were imperialists seeking to find ways to restore the British Empire, either through cutting a deal with Nazi Germany or post-war, post-Second World War, by embracing the idea of Europe a nation, very similar to the ideas that are being propagated by European politicians such as von der Leyen and Callas today. But today's fascists in Britain are really not about British imperialism. They're a comprador fascism. They are fascists in the service of US imperialism, and they take their political messaging, their political money and funding very much from the US right. So I think it's difficult for them to transfer MAGA into make England great again or make Britain great again. It really doesn't work. They've got a bit of a problem, and Farage, who's soared in the opinion polls as Starmer has slumped because he's seen as being a sort of populist. Farage's biggest Achilles heel is the fact that he stood in that golden lift in Trump Tower with Donald Trump, and that photograph is going around the internet and will never disappear. Farage is seen as being in Trump's pocket. You mentioned the squealing little fash Stephen Yaxley Lennon earlier. You called him by his stage name, Tommy Robinson.
Right. That's
right. He again put on a big show in London last summer, probably the biggest fascist organised rally in this country's history. Around about 120,000 people attended it. Not all of them fascists, but it was organised by the fascists. And yet Robinson, or Yaxley Lennon, to give him his correct name, Yaxley Lennon is funded by money coming from Elon Musk, and Musk is, consciously promoting a far right fascist political strand in Britain, in Germany, and no doubt in other countries in Europe as well. So these are not, if you like, traditional British or European fascists. These are people who are useful tools of the leading world imperialist power, the United States, and they will be exposed. That is their weak point. That is where they get their funding from. So it's their main strength, but it's also their weak point, because they cannot act as the real popular representatives of the people of either Britain or Italy or Germany or wherever they decide to set up shop.
Well, that's an interesting thing that you discussed, because what I've seen here in Italy, and this is where my criticism of immigration being assigned as racist is born. It's the same paradigm as where you have the Texas governor shipping up the immigrants to Martha's Vineyard. Very smart move, because that same paradigm exists here. It's very easy for people in Brussels to be talking about open borders when it's Greece and Italy and Spain paying the price for their choices. And when I say paying the price, we should go deeper. You never see articles on the BBC or the Times, anywhere, discussing the reasons for the immigration, such as never-ending imperialist wars and displacement. We rarely hear about what happened in Syria, one of the greatest displacements in hundreds of years. This is amazing. The diaspora from Syria is understated constantly in the media, not to mention our creation of offshoot groups. We go to Afghanistan. I'm sorry, but it becomes funny at a certain point, because Monty Python could be writing itself just by the news headlines. The U.S. sets up shop to get rid of Al-Qaeda and instead create splinter groups. And that's exactly what happened. HTS, he's the bad boy. No, he's in a suit and tie. He has a new name, just like the Ursula von der Leyen rebranding Rearm Europe. He was rebranded. It's all about rebranding. Oh, George W. Bush, he's a kind elderly painter now. He paints in his spare time. Let's love him. And you had that being pimped out.
Has he got an exhibition? Has he got any exhibition going on yet?
I bet he does, somewhere in Fort Worth or something, God knows. Yeah. I mean, or the fact that the Bin Ladens were regular guests at the ranch in Texas. We found this out.
Maybe he'll get a wing at the Guggenheim or something.
Well, inshallah, I mean, good for him. I mean, North American culture specializes in this kind of rebranding to feed the amnesia. And I fear that as much as we all have these smart devices and can Google stuff, and I got that message from that feminist about how I would have been feeding the bodies to the Third Reich, it's like, wait a sec. There's no logic going on. There's no thinking going on here at all. So I begin to wonder if, for instance, we've been paying 4 times, 5 times the fee for heating our homes, for filling our cars up. Okay? I don't think it's that different there where you are in England. The fees have gone up, both because the U.S. bombed, it would seem, the pipeline that was allowing Germany to keep industrializing, but that has fallen to the side, both the industrialization part and media talking about what the U.S. did. Workers in Germany, just like workers in England and workers here, are not stupid, but somehow the connections aren't being made between the media representing correctly that the U.S. bombed the pipeline, allowing us to have cheap Russian gas. And I'm sure you picked this up, that von der Leyen, she lauds herself on having orchestrated the end of buying evil Putin. And she has to have the white cat that Putin strokes with his fingers and a gold pinky ring on it. And she says, we've liberated ourselves from him. But no, she created another ecological disaster, because all Russia's doing is piping its fuels over to India to refine and ship back to us at a very high price tag. That's all that's gone on, right? So it's all BS from the top down. They're telling us lies to what? What's the point of Rearm Europe when it's not going to be von der Leyen or Starmer's children serving an alleged war?
Well, absolutely. It's important. It's a really important point to make, because what's going on here with Rearm Europe in Germany is quite shocking. So we're talking about conscription is now being introduced, where Merz has introduced legislation for there will be a voluntary call-up to the Bundeswehr, to the German army. If sufficient numbers are not forthcoming, then the plan is to conscript German youth to the army by a lottery, a conscription lottery. I was in Paris a couple of weeks ago speaking with trade unionists in Paris, and the general secretary of one of the teachers' trade unions was telling me the same militarization of education is taking place in French schools, where the army, the French military are being sent into schools to do presentations to school students about the great future that awaits them if they join the military. The teachers are being told if the kids are bright, they should go to university. If they don't make the university grades, they go to the barracks, or à la caserne, as I was told. So these are the. And we're hearing statements from German generals, French generals, British generals that are blood-curdling about how European populations must get used to sacrifice the next generation in the way that our predecessors did. They're making explicit references to the mentality which pervaded Europe in the run-up to the First World War, the mentality of inter-imperialist rivalry. And this is going to lead in one direction and one direction only, and that is to a generation of young people being sacrificed in another pointless war. That Britain in the post-war era, and particularly, post Suez Crisis, 1956, when Britain withdrew from east of Suez, and effectively withdrew its imperial, its colonial and imperial presence from most of east of Suez, with a few exceptions, such as the Diego Garcia in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean. But the but post 56, the British Army went from being a conscription army in which there was national service to being a so-called professional army in which officers were supplied from universities and from Sandhurst and from the upper and upper middle classes, while the other ranks, the non-commissioned ranks, were supplied from the most deprived working class cities in the main, from South Wales, from Scotland, from the north of England, from Tyne and Wear, from Liverpool, from Manchester. And the great song of Elvis Costello, Oliver's Army, which is precisely about the conscription of working class youth into the army, and the con which they were presented with, that this would offer them a future. And we've seen that situation for the British was used in order to attempt to pacify their colonial presence in Kenya, in Cyprus, and then in Ireland. And the Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland troubles from the early 1970s, in which the British Army and British military intelligence deployed large numbers of troops in Ireland, in British-controlled Ireland, was a generational trauma which we forget. It's been to some extent, I think this has been underappreciated today, because we've been through 20 years or more than 25 years of non-stop wars, from Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya to Syria, as you just mentioned, and now we're bombing Yemen and sending spy flights over Gaza and getting ready to bomb Iran. But that period in the 1970s was traumatic in British working class society. There was a hot war going on the territory controlled by the British government. I think it would be very difficult for the British ruling class to re-establish a mass conscription army. And in some ways, I think they'd be very reluctant to do so, because one of the problems with training your people in the use of weapons is that you are creating a time bomb that could blow back against you, as there were some examples of that with troops coming back from occupied Ireland. So we're in this extraordinary position now, where these political leaders in Europe, von der Leyen, who has no democratic mandate whatsoever because she was never elected by anyone, she's an appointed commissioner, Callas, who previously was the prime minister of a country of less than 1 million people, because 2/3 of them have left in order to get better jobs with a better standard of living in Scandinavia, Germany, or Britain, and is now running European foreign policy on behalf of the EU. Incredibly, a woman with a shocking ignorance of history and political reality. And then you have Merz, Macron, and Starmer, people whose collective opinion polls are still probably only barely in double digits. So it's a series of leaders with no authority, no popular authority, who are committing the next generation of European countries to conscription, to public spending on the military, which will wipe out the existing welfare states in those countries. I mean, when you step back for a moment and consider the ambitiousness of what they're trying to achieve, it's quite breathtaking. And what is needed, of course, is a mass movement in the streets based on young people, based on trade unionists, based on people with a politically conscious people who say, no, we are not going down this route. We do not want to live in a warfare society. And this seems to me is the biggest challenge facing the left in Britain and in Europe at the moment. That is to create a mass resistance to the warfare state. And we've had some signs in Britain of success. Last year, we were able to win a position at the British Trade Union Congress, which reversed their previous commitment to support increases in arms spending. And that was reversed, and they now have a position, a policy at least, on paper, of opposing increases in arms spending and calling for wages, not weapons, as their main sort of economic position on the arms industry. But I think this goes back to the point you made earlier about materialism and idealism. If those people are sucked into a project that is about identity, that privileges their individual multiple identities, as opposed to their unity with working class people who've been stripped of jobs for years, who've been subjected to outsourcing, who've been subjected to forced migration, who've lost their homes, who don't have the ability, who are being exploited by private landlords just as they are. Then, if we can't build a class unity between the working class and sectors of what you might call the middle class, but who've been rejected by capitalism in its current form, then I think we've got a problem. So a key part of that is building class alliances between organised labour in its different forms, through community organisations, campaign groups to defend hospitals and social services and local public services, trade unions, housing campaigners, etc. Building those links between those organisations and the people you're talking about, who are being cast aside by the system, but retain, if you like, perhaps a certain amount of cultural capital that they've accumulated from their education and from the role that they've played up till now. That's an important consideration and something that needs to be discussed much more deeply, I think.